Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and we're finishing up our discussion on immigration. So let's talk about non-European immigrants or visible minorities.
Yeah, so we've had a quite long look at the other groups coming in, but if you're looking at the position that kind of really non-white, non-European groups have in the hierarchy, it's really, really low. And there's actually a debate about whether or not black people and Asian people should be allowed in to the country at all. And the opinion in general is no. That they won't be able to be assimilated, especially, oddly enough, especially for Asian people, because it was felt by this time that especially the Chinese had gone to the absolute top of civilized behavior, and now they kind of fallen over the other side, so it's like a kind of strange argument that they were uber civilized, and now things were starting to go wrong for them. So Clifford Sifton, who we've spoken about quite a few times, he opposed a scheme to settle blacks from the Barbados, which of course, part of the empire, so that's really odd as well. And there is opposition within Alberta to black families coming up and moving into the province, and it's quite strong, this opposition, although there are at least 5 communities with black families in them, including Amber Valley, which is up in the north by Athabasca. And there are indeed a few hundred farmers and their families that arrive in 1908 in southern Alberta and then move throughout the province. But really that's it. This is one kind of move, and then when the next attempt comes for black farmers to come into the province, the government shuts it down quite quickly. But it's not just the government, it's the citizens as well. So people in general had all the same prejudices, I suppose, that Americans would have had as well. So the opposition to black immigration is seen best in the case of the Oklahoma farmers trying to leave the U.S. Because of the post-Civil War backlash against them and the imposition of Jim Crow laws. So things aren't going well for them at all, and so of course looking for some other place to settle. And the government does everything, the federal government does everything in its power that it can possibly do to discourage them from refusing or trying to refuse. I laugh there because this is of course an issue. How do you refuse information about Canada to black families in America? Well, first of all, you have to know that it's black families that are asking for information so that you can refuse it. So the government has a problem right away, because we've seen this incredible promotional machine even in America trying to get people to come to the Canadian West. So now they're kind of like backpedaling and going, yeah, but we only want a specific kind of immigrant. We don't want to say what kind, but we don't want the information to go to them, so it's a really strange situation. So they wanted to refuse information to them. They also wanted to enforce rigorous border medicals to kind of say, oh, you're not well enough to come into our country. And they even at one point drafted an order in council to bar them. They don't have to pass that because they've done enough, as it turns out, to dissuade people from coming. And they even send a black doctor into America from Canada to work in different communities that seem quite keen on coming to Canada, the Canadian West at least. And the black doctor is, of course, supposed to say, hey, this isn't really the place for you. And you get this approach: you'll probably starve to death or you'll freeze to death. You're just not suited to this climate. And we know that there was a clause in the Immigration Act that said that you could stop people from coming in that wouldn't be suited to the climate. So this is very interesting because, of course, we've seen that in the general propaganda, the general stuff looking at bringing people into the country, we never say, ooh, to anybody else, ooh, it's really, really a tough climate and it's going to get to -40 and you're just going to freeze to death. What do we say? We say, Canada has a bracing climate. That'll be good for you, right? So we say that to everybody else, and yet to this one group that we don't want, we're like, oh, you'll freeze to death if you come here. So it just shows you the prejudices of the day. And this is just a little thing from the Edmonton newspaper, April 29th, 1911. The Edmonton chapter of the United Farmers of Alberta have joined the drive led by the Edmonton Board of Trade to ban the settlement of blacks from Oklahoma into this province. The secretary of the Board of Trade, yada yada, argued against the growth of the black community in Alberta, saying, and I quote, "Those Negroes who have been here some time have had a square deal and have been treated as whites, but you would get 1,000 more and conditions would be much changed. Then they would be treated as they were in the South." So you have that, and 3,400 people signed this petition and asking for a ban on settlement, and it was followed by other boards of trade across the prairies doing exactly the same thing. So no, no, hey, welcome to Canada signs at all. And also from the Glenbow Archives, a little article about racial groups unwelcome in Alberta. And this one, the first part of it anyway, is about black settlers to Alberta, and it talks about by 1911 the estimate is 1,000 black settlers had come despite the discouragement or outright harassment at the border or on arrival in the province. And a group led by Jefferson Davis Edwards, 22, established Amber Valley, a thriving community of 350 people east of Athabasca with a church, school, a post office, and farms. And then it just goes on to talk about this Edmonton Board of Trade thing, April 1910, when a member named Powell, reportedly a Canadian who'd spent a great many years in the southern states where the principal work of the police courts is in the handling of cases of Negro crime. That's the quote about him, kindled the flames. Black settlers, he said, were a serious menace, and Edmonton's 100 black residents had a demoralizing effect. Even the best of Negroes are not desirable as citizens since they are unassimilable with whites. And he urged a $1,000 head tax on anybody that wanted to come in, which of course would dissuade the majority. Another person who was on the Board of Trade says reflected a sizable cross-section of Alberta opinion. This particular person in an newspaper interview, said, "The finger of fate is pointing to lynch law, which will be the ultimate result if you let people in." And blacks were refused service in Calgary hotel bars. The Attorney General said that he couldn't force hoteliers to serve anyone, so not much support from the government. And then, of course, 1911, the Trade and Labour Council passed an anti-black resolution on the grounds that an unlimited influx of Negroes into the province would lower the standard of living. And this is from Alderman Hindman on the City Council. "I have no animosity towards the Negroes. Because a man is black, it shouldn't be held against him, but it's not for the good of the country to have them settle here." So you just get this kind of constant onslaught of stuff. And it says that despite that, a trickle of black families still came to the province. This, of course, is before the KKK reached here in the 1920s. So they're still kind of ahead of that particular wave. So very, very interesting. And there's a historian called Bruce Shepherd, Bruce Shepherd, but Bruce Shepherd is the moniker he writes under, and he's written many, many articles on the Oklahoma farmers coming into the province, and this is from an article called "Black Immigration, a Dilemma for Canada," and he just goes through the same basic things that I've been saying, that Canada was advertising homesteads in America, and so of course making it sound like a wonderful place. Of course people responded to it, black and white, and the government became really concerned about this. And of course one of the ways that they worked out to kind of get around black families actually receiving this information was to send the information, if it was asked for, to send it to the local post office, because the postmaster or the postmistress would then be able to identify if it was a white or a black family and not give it if it was a black family. So kind of thinking outside the box there. And then he goes on to say that as early as 1899, an immigration agent in Kansas City was told that, and I quote, "It is not desired that any Negro immigrants should arrive in Western Canada. The next idea was to have the medical inspectors at the border find them medically unfit to enter the country. The American Consul General in Winnipeg discovered that Canadian immigration authorities were offering bribes to the medical inspectors for every black immigrant they rejected." But it says, he goes on to say, to their credit, the doctors don't appear to have accepted them. In any case, it's kind of a haphazard process. and that Canadian immigration officials could use the clause in the Immigration Act that allowed them to prohibit entry to any group thought to be incapable of surviving in Canada's harsh climate, that bracing climate for everybody else. And so he just looks at a couple of other things like that, and then talks about the doctor being sent into America, a black doctor from Chicago used as an agent. Dr. Miller toured Oklahoma for the summer of 1911, persuading blacks not to go to Canada. And he did this by contacting black ministers and then holding meetings and saying to people, you know, it really isn't for you. This will be, you know, this will be a disaster. Don't go at all. And this tied into the to Booker Washington's idea of stay where you are and work. You know, so don't just leave because of that. And then Shepherd kind of ends up saying, well, the other thing that started to turn the tide against people wanting to come up was that you started to see reports in the newspapers about how they hadn't really been wanted and how much opposition they faced. You know, people saying, oh, we'll run them out of town if they come to our little village and things. So he just concludes that, you know, the Canadian reaction to black migration shows that their ancestors suffered from the same myths and stereotypes about blacks as did white Americans. But a very interesting little, you know, bit in this whole glorious story of immigration. You know, open the doors, everybody in, and it's like, yeah, everybody in except you, and you. You can stand over there and stand behind that, and we're not going to let you in. The other groups, the two other main groups that were affected by non-white prejudice are the Chinese and the Japanese. And the Chinese, of course, face the most opposition because in Alberta they're here in some number. There's about 1,700, which doesn't sound like a lot, really, but 1,700, and they worked as domestics. They're seldom involved in farming, not really their fault because they don't have a lot of capital. And a few of them brought their wives with them because originally, of course, we know from our discussion of building the railway that they came in as labour to build the railway, and the government did actually impose a head tax of $50 and the CPR paid it. But as soon as the railway was finished, so after 1885, then they're not needed, and you get the same reaction from labour in general. These people will work for less, and so in the end that will be negative for Canadian workers. So there's actually only, great market. It's a great market. 20 Chinese women in Alberta and 1,700 Chinese men. So it's like you could have your pick of the crop, really. They're attacked on racial grounds. They were thought to be, by this time, although it hadn't been true earlier on, as I've said before, they were thought to be culturally inferior, impossible to assimilate, and people who participated in gambling, opium smoking, and the greatest myth of all, the white slave trade, that they would enslave white women, keep them in cages, send them back to China, and they'd be sexual prisoners forever. And that kind of wave of panic, this kind of moral panic, ran right up and down the West Coast, all the way through to the 1920s. And Marianne Valverde has a really interesting article on that and on the kind of racial prejudices of the day. So very interesting. So in Alberta and in other places, especially in BC, there's actually a move to segregate them. Then of course you know where they are, you know where their businesses are, and you see all sorts of business, boycotts of their businesses. Usually it's, in the prairie provinces, it's usually every small town had a Chinese restaurant, and every town had a Chinese laundry. So you knew where they were, and that's the kind of sad part, because I think we would probably agree that it would be fun to go down to Chinatown to have a meal. Co-hosts do occasionally eat out together. I have to look after you some way.
That's true.
So we think, oh, well, that'd be fun. Let's go down to Chinatown. It's so cute and it's so Chinese and it's all red and it's lovely and they have great food there. Not really thinking about the origin of the Chinatowns. And the origin of the Chinatowns is, let's get all the Chinese people in the same place so that we know where they are, and let's pass bylaws so that they can't buy property outside of that place. So in fact, you're just kind of ghettoizing people, sticking them in there so you know where they are at all times, and if you want to boycott their businesses, you know where that is too. So it's kind of sad, because we think of it as, when I went to San Francisco, I was like, I have to get to Chinatown, like you just think, oh, that's cool, like a big touristy thing, but it doesn't really begin that way at all. So it'd be like if there's a little Scottish ghetto everywhere, everywhere we went. Well, there's Glasgow, but there's a Scottish ghetto. You'd be like, oh, that's so fun, so much fun. Let's go and eat some haggis and chips in the Scottish ghetto. And then the Scottish people in there would be like, yes, it might be covered in tartan, but we were forced to live like this, you know, baby, we were forced to live like this. It'd be the latest Lady Gaga song.
Right.
Not I was born this way, but I was forced to live this way. So that's kind of interesting. Now, their businesses, not only were they subject to boycott, but there was also this moral panic about this white slave trade. So at one point, quite early on in 1911, there was legislation passed in Saskatchewan to stop white girls or white women working for Chinese men, because it was thought it would have an impact on their morals. So this is from the Regina newspaper, December 12, 1912. Working women in Saskatchewan now face a new obstacle. The provincial government has made it illegal for white women to work in restaurants and other businesses owned or managed by Chinese. This act was passed allegedly to preserve the morality of white women. So guarding women against themselves, you know, the usual. Those in desperate need of money may have been tempted to gain employment in such establishments, but will now be protected from their own actions. The Chinese themselves are still welcome in this province. And I was saying to somebody the other day, I've never really understood this sentence. Maybe you can enlighten me. The Chief Justice of BC, Matthew Begbie, also called the hanging judge, said in a Royal Commission report in 1885, and I quote, and this is about the Chinese, "They do and do well what women cannot do and do what white men will not do." I'm like, what is that? Gardening, laundry, ironing? Like,
don't know.
What could that possibly be?
Don't know.
Like, it just sounds weird. They do what women cannot do, so that can't be laundry and cooking. And they do what white men will not do, take out the garbage. I don't know. It's just an odd. I've always wondered
That's
what
strange,
that meant, and
yeah.
somebody will probably tell me exactly what it means. But it seems odd. So it says the new law will affect every town in the province for most of Chinese restaurants and laundries, but the number employing white women is actually estimated to be quite low. So not really a panic at all, but just this moral panic. And I have some other things along with some stuff from the Glenbow about Lethbridge, when Lethbridge enforced a Chinese ghetto. And this is in 1910. They decided that they would ban Chinese laundries from this particular part of town and then shove everybody in together. And they said that, you know, it was on the basis that the laundries really smelled, but they were actually white-run laundries right on the next street. So it couldn't have been that at all. But they created what amounted to a Chinese ghetto. And the other term for Chinese people was Sons of Confucius. Say Sons of Confucius or Celestials. So they called it a celestial ghetto. So it's not like a starry ghetto, but it's just like that. And so it says Lethbridge's anti-Oriental disposition had two causes. Coal miners were worried that the Chinese who came to the city after the Crow's Nest Pass Line was completed would provide extra cheap labour and, of course, drive the wages down. And secondly, the Chinese community was viewed as a dangerous source of laudanum, and that's opium in alcohol. And I know that you wouldn't know anything about that at all. It's a kind of old school thing, and really, really popular in among the elite in like Britain in the 1880s and 1890s. So the Chinese were thought to be chronic users of opium, and there were all these panics again, kind of moral panics about drugs. Yes, about drugs on the prairies. And in this case, this is just a little story about Detective Pat Egan grabs suspicious celestial who lands in Lethbridge with 7 tins of opium, said the headline. And really, that told the whole story, because it wasn't much beyond that. It was like, and a celestial was picked up. The guy gets off the train late at night from Vancouver, and he's got a little grip, their version of a little suitcase. And immediately, not because he's racist or anything, the detective who's on the platform is like, oh, a celestial. And he's a big one, a big tall one. Could have played played basketball. Big tall guy, and he's got a hand grip, and he's like, "What's in that?" And the guy goes, "I'm not telling you." And he goes, "What's in that?" And the guy throws the key away, and then they get into a big fight, and then he's just like, and he gets arrested. And of course, they find the key, and they open up the thing, and there's 7 tins, as it says in the headline, 7 tins of opium inside, and each weighed half a pound, and you would have got $15 a tin for it, so good prices in those days. And he also had $95 on his person. So then they were in a panic in case this, he was coming to meet a whole bunch of people, or trying to work out if this was a kind of isolated incident. And I think it was an isolated incident in this case. And then you have just the general attitude. We talked about the attitude towards black people. So you have this generalized attitude towards Chinese people in particular. And this is from the case of Calgary. So the Chinese community had been kind of pushed out of its previous location by the Canadian Northern Railway expansion. So it pulled its money, and it was about to create its own little kind of, Chinatown area in the place that it still is today, Centre Street and 2nd Avenue. And angry property owners in the area demanded that the council segregate the Chinese, and if they were actually going to buy anything there, it had to just be all of them and not the rest of the population. And so, so this spokesman in Calgary said, and get this, I mean, this is even worse, said that the Chinese, and I quote, should be treated much the same as an infectious disease or an isolation hospital. They lived like rabbits in a warren, 30 of them crowd in where 5 white people would ordinarily reside. And you hear all those kinds of prejudices against different groups in the modern period too. So this is an old thing. And so there's just kind of to continue with this idea, in Red Deer there was a speaker addressed the Young Men's Club on the question or the issue of the yellow peril, which is of course what they called Chinese people, the yellow peril. And this was in Christmas 1913, and stated that Orientals were a menace to law and order, to sanitation, to good morals, and were hard to assimilate politically because they formed a class far too easily bought by unscrupulous politicians. Like John A. Macdonald hadn't been buying votes and everybody else. So it's not, again, we don't have a clean sheet on that one either. And so it says a few days earlier, some Stettler High School students won a debate in Red Deer, taking the affirmative on resolve that the Canadian government should exclude Oriental immigrants. And so the key debater spoke with great sincerity, said that Orientals were degraded, ignorant, untruthful, deceitful, avaricious, vindictive, and apt to brood morbidly over fancied wrongs, as if the other stuff wasn't enough. They're like, yeah. They were also, because obviously that's not enough to totally condemn people, they were also conspirators, smugglers, and were willing to work for a mere pittance, and we need to teach them the dignity of labour. And right at the end, the student said that not only that, but my little final statement, that Orientals brought in strange diseases such as leprosy. So there you go. So they're bringing in leprosy. I mean, it's just absolutely shocking. So, of course, there's opposition in BC as well, but we have lots of good information for Alberta too. The federal government set up a royal commission on Chinese and Japanese immigration in 1902, and they said that Asians were, again, a quote, unfit for full citizenship, obnoxious to a free community, and a danger to the state. So not a completely open door policy for everybody. One BC senator said, and again I quote, "They are not of our race and cannot become part of ourselves." So not much chance that the things are going to ease up for the Chinese. And as I said before, they were paying a head tax. The government thought that one of the best ways to stop or to just decrease the migration of Chinese men into Canada was to increase the head tax. So in about 1903, they increased it to $500, which is almost impossible for people to be able to afford. And of course, it meant that you couldn't bring your wives with you, and you couldn't afford to bring your families in. So you have like this kind of all-male society, really, or mostly all-male society. And in in that year, in 1903, the numbers of applicants dropped into the single digits from about 4,000 a year. So it did actually have an impact. But also in the 1920s, the government decided to go one step further and pass what we unofficially called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So no Chinese people were to be allowed to come in, and really it covers all Asian people, not just Chinese people at all, but it covers all Asian people. And so from 1923 until it's kind of dropped in the late 40s, there's virtually no Asian immigration into Canada. It's just not allowed. So there's actually a thing called the Head Tax Redress Campaign, where the Chinese community started saying in the 80s to the government, you took all this money off us to come in, and we think you should apologize and we should get some of that money back. The government collected $23 million in head tax from Chinese immigrants before they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that halted all Chinese immigration until 1947. Fewer than 50 Chinese were allowed to enter into Canada in that period from 1923 to 1947. We forget about that. And the damage claim for the head tax collected was valued at $1.2 billion in 1988. And so the Chinese Canadian National Council was asking for restitution, because the government at that point was actually apologizing for a couple of things. I had some other things to apologize for as well. And in 1988, there were 2,500 survivors of the head tax still alive in Canada. And I think that the government actually finally settled it in 2006, but my impression is, and I could be wrong, my impression is that the last head tax plaintiff had already died by that time. There are two other people on the claim, but I think what they did was the government gave money for educational purposes to kind of let people know. Do you remember studying that in high school? No, so the money didn't go far then. Didn't really help at all. So that's the Chinese story in a nutshell. And of course, as well, they weren't allowed to be lawyers. They weren't allowed to be pharmacists, of course, because of the supposed connection with opium smoking. And I think notaries, there were a couple of professions that they were shut out of until 1947. And the reason that changes in the late 40s is because during World War II, you get the creation of the United Nations, replaces the League of Nations, and it passes the Declaration of Human Rights in the late 40s. And Canada had to kind of fess up that it wasn't letting some people in, and other people didn't have the vote. Asians didn't have the vote either, and so it had to kind of clean up its act for that purpose alone. So you have the Japanese facing opposition in BC, and BC like a hotbed of prejudice, I think, and they don't probably suffer as much during World War I or that early period. Of course, their story is going to come up later when we talk about World War II and the deportation of the Japanese into the interior of British Columbia, and all the rights been taken off them and their stuff being sold off. And it may well have been that it was a bit of, by World War II, that it's a bit of economic jealousy, because they become really, really great farmers, and they're part of the coastal Pacific network, and they do really, really well. But in 1907, in this early period, you do actually see riots in places like Vancouver against the Chinese and against the Japanese, and they called it protests against the flow of yellow and brown immigration to Canada. So you have mobs descending on Chinese and Japanese parts of town, attacking people and destroying property. So there is, outward visible signs of prejudice at that period. The last group that are the Canadian government acts against, I guess, is East Indians. And this is a result of the arrival of a ship called the Komagata Maru, which you can Google and look up. Really interesting story. 376 East Indians on board. It's kind of set up as a test case, because you're supposed to be able to move from one part of the British Empire to the other without being stopped. But there's a thing called continued passage, and you had to have started, and you would, in this case, have had to have started in India and ended up in Canada and not stopped anywhere. And they actually stop in Japan. And so BC politicians use this as a reason reason for not allowing them to land. So they actually just keep them far enough offshore that you can't kind of swim for Canada. So you have all these people that, and it does seem to have been set up as a test case by a businessman in India. But they're kept at, they're not allowed to dock in BC, and BC politicians are determined that they'll be sent back, and in fact that's what happens, and one or two of them are jailed as a result of the whole incident once they get back to India. One Conservative MP said at a public rally that, again, a quote, that immigration of Orientals to Canada would leave not a vestige of the civilization of which we are so proud. So everybody's kind of lumped into that Oriental, anybody from the subcontinent, Malaysia, Japan, China, any of those places. And of course, I said before that the Immigration Act barred some groups and gave the government power to deport others, and insisted on a head tax for those that were allowed in from these special groups. So you have Canada signing the UN Charter in 44, and then the Declaration of Human Rights coming in 48, and so they had to get rid of their glaringly discriminatory policies. And the government was also by this time responding to Asian lobby groups that were demanding the vote. So anyone from India and China got the vote in 47, and the Japanese get it in 49, and the federal government repealed the Chinese Immigration Act, or this restrictive act, and then in 47 also passed a Citizenship Act so that you could become a citizen of Canada. And it gave citizenship to all Canadians, whether born here or not. But if you were an immigrant, you had to have lived here for 5 years, and you could vote if you'd been here for 1 year and you were a British subject, or you were an immigrant that had served in the war. So, kind of an interesting story. Of course, the Chinese come in for the most opposition in the early period, but when it gets to World War II, it's going to be the Japanese that that everybody kind of in BC turns upon. And just this sense of we are an Anglo-Saxon nation. There hadn't been any Anglo-Saxons since 1066 in the Battle of Hastings, when all those French Normans had come over and changed everything. But just this sense, and we talked about this with Clifford Sifton as well, that he was seen as being like way too progressive, because he was going to let people from the Balkans in and all sorts of people that weren't Anglo-Saxon. But his sense was that he wanted people that were farmers. And we know that the Chinese and Japanese were really good farmers, but because of the other thing, these other sets of prejudices. And I think, for black immigration, the key word there would be, it was Oklahoma farmers that were trying to come up. So it was people that were actually could farm. They were trying to come up. So obviously there's this other thing going on. And Valverde talks about in one of her articles, she talks about the fear of race mixing. And that somehow, and all sorts of groups, that black men were thought to have insatiable sexual desires for white women. And if you've ever seen any of the pictures of those white immigrant women from the 1890s, they all look like the Wicked Witch of the West. So it's certainly not their good looks that they're coming up for. So all these weird ideas about, the sexuality and the sensuality of one group, or the neuroticness of another group, and all the terrible things that will happen if there's any mixing of these two together. So all this stuff's all kind of, being distilled. And the general fear, I think for Western Europeans, the general fear that Europeans have far too slack an attitude towards alcohol, and they might, do silly things like drink wine at lunch and let their kids have it. So it's just like fears about absolutely everybody. And then this kind of other strange belief that everybody in Canada is Anglo-Saxon, and we all share the same cultural values and the same attitudes and approaches to everything, when it's not really true. And where do French Canadians fit into that as well? Slightly different. So so that's enough about the bad stuff, but it's good to know. And of course it's good because we know that we don't believe those kind of things anymore. So it does show some progress and some growth on our part. Thank heavens it does.
So compared to the last 2 or 3 groups, Europeans seem to have done well. But I remember seeing the plaque in Banff about Ukrainians being in internment camps in World War I. What's that about?
Yeah, well, that's good. That just shows that you're politically conscious and socially conscious,
that's what it was,
and you don't just go to the mountains to ski and drink Canadian beer. So that's really good.
Don't do either of those things.
Oh, good.
Go to look for historical items.
Oh, of course, just like I do. That's good. Okay, so Europeans, remember the Germans were right up there on the list of people we want because of that kind of Anglo-Saxon heritage and the culture that we all share. But of course, in World War I, the Germans become the Huns, which is also a name for Ranger supporters. The Huns, the barbarians, and the undesirables, they're the guys that are on the wrong side, right? They're on the bad side now. So suddenly you get a change in attitude and you're like, oh, they aren't as good as we thought. And you got all this propaganda. The Germans are raping nuns and they're sticking little Belgian children on the ends of their bayonets and just kind of leaving them out, and just awful. So anybody that had come in from the Axis powers, anybody that had come in from the wrong side, and that included all of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now those people were to be watched. So there's about 40,000 people at least that fall into the category of Austro-Hungarians who have to be watched. And this number goes as high as 80,000. And then if you add in the number of Ukrainians, because a lot of Ukrainians were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we tend to think of it as part of Russia, but that's after the war and the Russian Revolution. So the number is really, really high, and they're branded now as enemy aliens. So those very peasants in sheepskin coats that Clifford Sifton had wanted so badly, and those Germans that were thought to be so culturally similar to us, they become the ones that we're really worried about now. And so their activities are curtailed, especially Ukrainians. Many of them are dismissed from their jobs. They're put under surveillance. Their language schools, their churches are shut down. Their newspapers are either censored or shut down. And some of them are placed in internment camps. So there are actually internment camps across the country that goes, I'm just trying to think, I think it's like from Spirit Lake in Quebec in the east. Oh no, actually there's one in Amherst and Halifax as well, but they're all over the place, from eastern Canada all the way through western Canada and into BC. So you have 8,000 Ukrainians interned, and the rest of them had to register and report to the police weekly, and they had to hand in their guns, which is, unfortunate if you're a farmer, because I'm sure that you'd have lots of excuses for shooting stuff that was after your cattle and stuff. Not like I know a lot about farming and cattle, but I'm thinking that if a fox attacked my cow, I'd want to shoot it, if that would even happen. I don't. There's no foxes. Who knows? If a coyote attacked my sheep, I'd want to, not hit it over the head with a trowel. I'd want to get it. So that's what I think I would do anyway. I'm not really entirely sure. That's why I'm a city girl. So the people that were interned, they had to work. So they went to prison camps, really internal prison camps, and they have to work. So they work on road building, land clearing, railway construction. They built the Jasper water mains. They built the Banff Golf Course, which is probably where you saw your plaque. And they built the Cavan Basin, which is the old sulphur pools, not the one up Sulphur Mountain, but the other one that's kind of, when you come over that wee main bridge and by the museum, you turn right and you go to the Cavan Basin. And the Cavan Basin was declared a historic site of internment in, I think, 2010. So it's a really brutal regime. I mean, it's all men, of course. They're just kind of banged into these places. They got 25 cents a day in wages, but all of their property was seized, including cash, and the value then was 1.5 million, and their property was auctioned off at 10 cents on the dollar, whether they had children and wives and families or not. And if you're interested in this little bit of our history, you should watch the NFB video, National Film Board video, Freedom Had a Price, and it's all about the internment process. And it was really, really harsh, very, very harsh. Again, you're effectively locked up. You're actually being guarded like you are in a prison, because you are actually in a prison. And they had no newspapers in the camps. Their letters were censored. They had to maintain the camps as well. And some of the pictures just look awful. Like they would have to walk, a mile or 2 miles to the place that they were working in like minus 40 degrees with, kind of minimal clothing, and they're not well fed. And some of them went on hunger strikes. They were mistreated by the guards. Others tried to escape and were shot dead. So this is like hardcore stuff. And full-scale riots were not uncommon, and they were also, just slap, yeah, all that stuff's happened. They're also disenfranchised in 1917, so the vote's taken off them in the Wartime Elections Act, and then hundreds of them are deported as well because of the Red Scare, because they of course, the internment camps should have shut down in 1918, right, when the war kind of ends, but some of the camps are kept open until 1920 because they're like, all those rebellious people are like, oh, maybe they'll be communists and they'll start a communist revolution on the prairie. So really, all the Bolsheviks are under watch. So it's another challenging time in Canadian history, and Lubomir Lusiak, the head of the Civil Liberties Commission of Ukrainian Canadian Committee, on behalf of those who were in these camps, said that the government should apologize for it. And said, maybe not looking for a kind of outright total apology, but certainly an acknowledgement that this wasn't even fair, even in wartime, and that it was wrong that people had to register as well as kind of enemy aliens. And in December of 1987, the government acknowledged its mistreatment of Ukrainians and said it was willing to negotiate redress, and they was readied for a settlement in the year 2000. And this actually comes in a bill, Bill C-331, for a restitution agreement for Ukrainians, which I have here, the actual bill, I do. And the purpose, it says, is to provide redress for the injustice done to persons of Ukrainian descent and other Europeans during the First World War, to commemorate the sad event in Canadian history, and to provide for restitution to be made. The restitution is to be devoted to educational materials dealing with Canada's past internment policies and activities, understanding about tolerance and the role of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so it's because of that kind of restitution and that bill that you saw some plaques about Ukrainian internment. And not everyone in the Ukrainian community was happy about the original plaque, because it really wasn't really as clear about what had actually happened. You know, if you read it, you wouldn't be like, that's terrible. You'd be like, oh, interesting, but didn't really clear up everything. So not as good as it could have been. So still been a bit of trouble over that. And of course, as part of that bill, the Ukrainian Canadian Restitution Act, there was to be a permanent museum established in Banff National Park at the site of the concentration camp, with signage in the three languages, Ukrainian, French and English, and also a little discussion, I suppose, about the role that Ukrainian Canadians have played in the building of the country since that point. And so it's all kind of very nice. And then I always kind of laugh, because it seems like in Canada you haven't really got over something unless you get a postage stamp about it. So part 4 of this says, the Minister of National Revenue shall instruct Canada Post Corporation to issue a stamp or set of stamps to commemorate the internment of persons of Ukrainian descent and other Europeans during the First World War. So I guess you know that you've really been apologised to when you get your commemorative stamp. And so in May of 2008, the Canadian government did actually establish a $10 million fund with the Ukrainian Canadian Foundation for a commemoration of the experience of thousands of Ukrainians and other Europeans that were interned between 1914 and 1920, and the suspension of civil liberties of tens of thousands of fellow Canadians. And they actually published a notice in 2009, September. They published a notice in the Globe and Mail, which is our national newspaper, and there's a website as well. So that's what happens to the Ukrainians. But you're probably saying to yourself, you're telling me all the bad stuff now, but did the Canadian government feel that it had been successful with its immigration policy?
That was my next question.
Was it your next question? God, it's like mind reading. It's great. We have this great connection. So yes, I think the answer is just yes, that the government did what it set out to do. McDonald had started it, and it hadn't really been successful because of the worldwide recession and everything. But by 1921, the prairie population had grown to about 2 million people, and although there had been lots of glitches, and although there were people that were left out and some people that were favoured more than others, It is a success, and they had freed up the appropriate amounts of land. But the strange thing is, of course, that the idea was that central Canada would remain the kind of dominant economic hub, and Western Canada would, of course, provide the natural resources. So we'd ship the grain back to them, and then in turn they would have made all this great furniture and stuff, and we'd buy the furniture. So that it would be even. And Western Canada wasn't really supposed to develop its economy beyond being a natural.
Yeah, now who's the have-not province?
Ha ha!
Hey, Central
right.
Canada?
That's right, Ontario. We've still got the oil. We'll remember
That's right.
Ralph Klein saying in the last big crisis, let those Eastern bastards freeze in the dark. So
Wow.
we've got all the wheat. So when the wheat prices go up, it's going to be your bread that's more expensive. Maybe we'll get cheap bread. Maybe we'll just grow wheat out the back of the history hut. We could do that. We could grow hops and make our own beer. We could grow wheat and make our own loaves. And,
It's probably oil under here.
And I accept the provincial government would probably come and take all of the oil if they found any. So if we find any, we're not going to tell anybody. Okay, co-host, we're not going to tell anybody. We'll just sell it, like round the corner from the history hut. We'll be like, just come to the history hut for some really good oil.
There you go.
Yeah. So it'll be okay. So and I suppose, although my family didn't immigrate until the very, very modern period, I suppose I am one of those children of immigrants, and so a success because I'm here, right?
There you go.
Kinda.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I guess that wraps up our talk on immigration. Join us next time for some more history.
Bye.